So, in the sense, it's autobiographical. So, what element or elements in your life, in your opinion, were most authentically revealed in the film?
Well, I mean, all of it is. I mean, from the ground up, I'm talking to you in the 11-foot wide row house where the real events took place.
Cool.
And we shot here. We shot in this house.
Wow.
And we shot where? Down the stairs where Chester was. And it was great because I have a Rolodex of images, so I could tell all the key creatives, okay, here's some photos. Here's what I was here's the dress I was wearing on Much Music. Emily, you can wear this. I tapped into my neighborhood in Kensington Market. I don't know if you've ever visited Toronto, but
I
it's an
haven't.
excellent neighborhood,
Mhm.
full of wonderful people. And I tapped into my neighbors who let me shoot in their restaurants and galleries and spaces. I found brothels that allowed me to shoot there. And I tapped into my friends who were generational musicians who, I grew up listening to in Vancouver. I grew up in Vancouver and, just reached out to post punks who I loved. And they're like, yeah, you can use my song. Or peers in music video. Like I worked at Canada's MTV Much Music
Right.
at a time when punk broke. So there's a lot of great independent music. And so tapped into a number of independent bands who their videos are great and they do a lot of heavy lifting because they're made from that era. So really, so many of the constraints of low budget filmmaking were actually the things that make this film so special. Being able to kind of cast real locations to play themselves and
Yeah.
exude authenticity. And of course, like I'm fudging the details. So it's not like life. Life is very different from the movie. Life doesn't necessarily fit into a story, but this is a story. So, trying where I can, like I'm reminded of Farley Mowat, a great Canadian writer, who said, "Don't hold me to the facts, but I know the truth in my heart." And it's the same here.
Nice.
There's something about like another thing that Chester brought up in his book was the parallel between queer liberation and the struggle for sex worker rights are the same struggle. So in the 80s, if you were a gay man in a bathhouse, the police would raid it and all of you would be arrested. And we've come a long way, in Canada, gay marriage is legal, and it's an interesting time for this movie to come out because so many of our hard-won rights are being stripped. And so it's a very interesting time of a collision of regress and progress. Like in terms of sex work, um, New Zealand decriminalized sex work. And 2 years ago, Belgium granted sex workers all the rights that any other job has. So they have dental, medical, they have holiday pay, childcare.
Mm.
That's really progressive, and it makes it so that workers can go about their work and not there are legal ramifications if anyone harms them. So they're much more protected, and so that is regress. And then we see what's happening in North America, and so it's a time of transition and a time where we really need to find ways to make the world a better place for everyone. And
Very good.
so, I'm so happy that this movie's coming out now because at the heart of it, it's not a very didactic film. I try to ask questions so that people can ruminate and reflect from their own experience as opposed to be told how to think. You
Right.
know, I kind of like spar with material. And at its heart, it's a love story.
Well, Toronto and your neighborhood, as you mentioned, is a distinct character in the film, especially the Toronto of the late 1990s and early 2000s is depicted. So, how has the bohemian side of the city changed in the last 25 years? Has the Toronto of your youth been lost to maybe real estate development in a more profit oriented city?
Well, I grew up in Vancouver.
Right.
And I came up in the 90s and it was a very rich scene where multimedia artists, poets, punks, performance artists, we all collaborated. There were places to play in the early days. So we would just like, go into a warehouse and put on a show, or like rent the Ukrainian hall and put on shows. And it was very activistic. And it was, what we rewarded was individual expression. So like a band from Salem, Oregon would come up and we're like, who are these witches? What are they doing? We never knew of them, but like everyone showed up to see what they were up to. And it was a very wonderful time. And that's how I was reared. And that's what I love in art, is kind of idiosyncratic expression with a kind of utility, something that's fun, but also has something about the human heart, has a humanist perspective to it. So I've been privy to many extraordinary scenes. I've lived long enough to be able to witness an incredible sketch comedy and punk scene in Calgary, Halifax pop explosion, incredible music that was coming out of Halifax. Oftentimes it's Olympia, Washington, all of that K record stuff. Like it's oftentimes these tiny little communities that give rise to extraordinary, impactful artistic movements. And I've been so blessed to see that. And just living in Toronto, seeing, scenes kind of like pop it, they come and go. They
Right,
can't stay forever. And
right.
I've seen at least three gens of various art communities coming up, three or four gens. And it always astonishes me. Right now, there's a very prolific psych scene in Toronto, and there was a kind of like maybe year, 2 year period between the indie scene before that and the psych scene, and yet they don't know each other. It astonishes me that in this information age, 2 years can pass, and maybe because they pop up in different places in the city, but there's definitely a through line with material. So people turn to me now and they're like, "What's it like? What happened?" And I feel like I'm walking around with this cultural knowledge. Extraordinary situations arise and occur, and but they don't always last forever. My neighborhood itself is very intact. It has been gentrified to a degree,
Okay.
but it repels gentrification. It still is full of pirates and hippies and punks. Our police force are the crust punks on the corner with their dogs.
Right.
So the stores have hand painted signs. I know my neighbors. I live and abide by my neighbors. We help each other out. They help me on my movies. My neighbor's Seth, who makes films as well as an animator. I worked on his, he worked on mine. It's a wonderful, brilliant community, and it's because the traffic is terrible. It's a circuitous road of like mess of one-way streets where there's no parking. So that's been kind of like our armor for gentrification. But, much of the city has like we were all locked down during COVID, and we walked out and it was like, oh my God, the city's been rearranged. Entire blocks have been the city's been busy while everybody was shut in here. They
Right.
demolished everything. So there was a real hunger for real estate development. And that happened in so many of the cities that I see. It's not just
Yeah.
Toronto. Every
Chicago
single
too.
city in Europe, everywhere.
Yeah. Yeah.
We see that, but now we're seeing kind of in Toronto a tanking. All these kind of like cheaply done big condos
Happens to us too.
are sitting empty, and
Oh,
they're decreasing in value. And they're ugly, and they're going to have to be rebuilt in 10 years, and still no one's even moved in. So there was a great deal of greed to build these cheap things and then decimate lively, character-filled neighborhoods. And that's the problem because cities don't realize people love a city when it's a breathing, living city. They love that. And if you're just going to go for the money and build these towers that are empty, you're going to have a shell of a city inside. We're seeing those consequences now in
yeah.
so many cities.
Yeah.
So, I think that the sustaining spirit, I mean, it was sad because as it became more unaffordable, a lot of artists were pushed out of Toronto. They had to move further afield to Hamilton. But now people are moving back because rents are going a bit low. So I kind of hope the economy tanks so that people can like reafford rent, you
Yeah.
know. So it's a common story. I try to deal with that in paying for it. So, I was hired as the VJ who was sort of the alternative music VJ the year punk broke. So I was the person who would interview Beck and Sonic Youth and like
Right.
all of those awesome bands, Stereo Lab and John Spencer Blues Explosion and all the great indie bands. Elliott Smith, an Radiohead. Um, but then after a while, the boy band phenomenon and prefab music came in, and suddenly I was like, this was live unscripted rock and roll television is why I was hired, and I did a lot of wacky things because there were hours to fill. And then suddenly it was like formulaic pop music, which kind of went with corporate culture. So I sort of articulate that in the movie, as well as the development of comics. When Chester first came out, he was standing on street corners holding up, his mini comic. And then he got a publishing deal, and then it became Underground Comics began to have a life. And then it was sort of taken over on the shelves by superhero comics. And then it wasn't until the rise of the graphic novel that they had another lease on life. And so I kind of show that arc and then also suggest the gentrification of cities. Now, a lot of the places that I live, like the wonderful thing is that, you know, the punk dive bar remains the same throughout North America and in Europe. My friend Dylan Gamble, who I made the score for in the movie, score with in the movie, he's in the band Hot Garbage, and he'll send me photos of places he's playing in Europe, and it's the same look of the 90s punk dive. So it's a ubiquitous, timeless look.
Yeah.
So all I had to go is go up to Sneaky D's around the corner and shoot there. I didn't have to change a thing because it was perfect.
Perfect.
And so those places do exist.
Yeah.
There's a lot, it's diminishing, but I hope with the slowdown of, condo development that some of the places will, have a few more years.
So you profoundly dealt with nudity and carnal intimacy in the film. What adjustments did you have to make on set in order to relax the exposure and gain trust from the actors?
Well, I made a movie. It was a groundbreaking queer film by John Cameron Mitchell called Short Bus years ago. I was the
Sure.
lead actor in that.
Hmm.
So I really understood, that was in the days before intimacy coordinators. That movie took 4 years to develop. All of the lead actors were cast before there was a script. So we came up with our characters through improvisation. I worked with John Cameron Mitchell. We engendered a sense of camaraderie and friendship throughout those 3 years of art camp. Many of the actors were real life couples, and in their way, we were each other's intimacy coordinators. There was
Right.
a great deal of care. I find that in the queer community, the baseline of just in human interaction is extremely high. There's an extremely high level of care and social responsibility and respect and love. And so with that movie, I learned a lot about what it requires and you know knowing that the topic and also what I was going to be asking of the actors, I knew that I had to get actors who were on board. They couldn't be squeamish about. They
Right.
they had to be ideologically in line with the material and want to put a movie of this nature out. So I had to cast, especially for the sex workers, actors with a nuanced understanding of the work. So not just piloting in somebody who has no idea,
Right.
you know, having people, these are musicians, performance artists, activists, they're comedians, they're filmmakers who deal with sex work in their own movies. And I had to get them in, just to explain this is what my aim is and this is what I'll be asking. I'll be asking for full frontal nudity from every person. Are you okay with that? Because if you're not, I understand, but this is the ask. And they were all like, okay, yeah. Some of them had never acted before, some of them are professional actors.
Hmm.
So all of them agreed. And all of them elevated the material because from their experience and understanding, they could tweak costume and tweak minute details for me. And then, of course, working with an intimacy coordinator. This is now a part of the crew, as important as a DP or a boom op or an editor.
Right.
So The intimacy coordinator has a conversation with each actor, and then instead of the actor having to come up and say something, and it might be difficult, the intimacy, it's understood. The intimacy coordinator expresses their needs, and of course, I work with their needs, and it's not always just like intimate areas that are sensitive. It could be something as seemingly benign as a shoulder or an elbow, so you must hear what they want in order to create a reciprocal environment. The work of a director, these are hard scenes because many times I would just I kind of like love Chester's panels, and there's a kind of oblique wide feeling to them, a very kind of yeah, kind of I don't know, graphic feeling to these compositions. I was really inspired by Edward Yang from the Taiwanese New Wave film movement, and also Leos Carax, his first movie. I knew I didn't have very much money, so I couldn't have too many setups. So I would set up one shot and have the actors move it in. And these are long scenes, and they're very, most movies cut away, cut, 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 cut. But you know, because it's hard to say a whole scene. And so these were challenging choreographically, but also hitting your beats all in one take. And Dan Byrne, who is an amazing actor and comedy mind, he plays Chester.
Yeah.
Again, Dan has a long list of like incredible accolades, and he's through and through a professional actor. But he was like during his audition, he was like, "Yeah, Sook-Yin, I'll do full frontal and I'll shave my head if you want me to," because he loved the material so much and wanted the part.
Beautiful.
And then I teamed him up with Emily Lay, who plays Sunny, and they're remarkable because together they bug each other a lot, but their relationship is grounded in love.
This is Patrick McDonald for HollywoodChicago.com. Copyright 2026.